It started with a text message at 3:17 a.m., a single word glowing on the screen in the darkness of my bedroom. Help. There was no name, no number, just the word. I would have ignored it, maybe chalked it up to a glitch or a prank, if not for one thing. It came from my sister's old phone, the one she had when she disappeared 10 years ago. Introduction. My name is James Morgan. I'm 29 years old, single, and working as a freelance photographer. Life's been fairly ordinary lately, though if you knew me 10 years ago, you'd probably think I wouldn't make it this far. Back then, I was a mess, angry at the world, bitter about losing my sister Ellie. She was 18, I was 19, and her disappearance shattered my family. Ellie was always braver than me. She loved exploring abandoned places, the creepier the better. Our town had plenty of them: empty factories, shuttered motels, and the old Ashmore house. That house, I never went inside, not once. Even as a teenager, I had enough sense to stay away. But Ellie wasn't scared. The police ruled it a runaway case, despite the fact that her car was still parked outside the house. They said there was no evidence of foul play, but they didn't look hard enough. They didn't hear the whispers people talked about, or the way the house seemed to swallow the light. I haven't thought about Ashmore in years, not until that text. The message sat there on my phone, casting a faint glow in the dark. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, maybe some sort of scam, but my hands were shaking as I typed a response. Who is this? 3 dots appeared. Someone was typing. I waited, heart pounding. Then the reply came.
It's me, Ellie.
I dropped the phone like it had burned me. For a few seconds, I just stared at it on the floor, half expecting it to disappear like some hallucination. But it didn't. The screen stayed lit, her name Ellie staring back at me. I picked it up again, hands trembling. Prove it, I typed. The response was immediate.
You were with me when I broke my wrist in the treehouse? You said it was my fault for climbing so high, but you cried when I had to get stitches? You still have the scar on your hand from pulling me down.
I froze. No one else knew about that. Not the details, not the scar. Where are you? Her reply sent a shiver down my spine.
The house. It won't let me leave.
I didn't go back to sleep that night. How could I? I spent hours pacing my apartment, staring at the text, wondering if I was losing my mind. Ellie was gone dead, most likely. But what if, by sunrise, I'd made up my mind? I packed a flashlight, my camera, and a crowbar for good measure. The Ashmore house was only a 40-minute drive from my apartment, but it felt like crossing into another world. The house hadn't changed much since the last time I saw it. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, before stepping inside. The smell hit me, first rotting wood and mildew, thick enough to make my stomach churn. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots as I moved through the front hall, flashlights sweeping across peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. Ellie? I called, my voice echoing in the empty space. Silence, silence. The living room was just as I remembered from the photos the police had taken: an overturned couch, shattered glass on the floor. My flashlight caught something on the wall, and I froze. It was writing, faint and jagged, scratched into the plaster.
Help me.
I swallowed hard. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow dart across the room. The text messages had stopped after Ellie told me she was in the house. No response, no updates. Just silence. I moved deeper into the house, past the living room and into the kitchen. The tiles were cracked, and the sink was full of stagnant water. I thought I heard something, a faint tapping sound, but when I stopped to listen, it was gone. The basement door was open. I stood there, staring into the pitch-black stairwell. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it the faintest sound, a whisper, maybe, though I couldn't make out the words. Ellie, I called again, my voice cracking. This time, there was a response. A soft, muffled cry. I almost tripped over my own feet running down the stairs. My flashlight danced across the damp walls, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. Ellie. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. The basement was larger than I expected, with stone walls and a dirt floor. In the corner, huddled against the wall, was a figure. For a split second, relief flooded me. It looked like her, the same dark hair, the same slim frame. Ellie, I breathed, stepping closer. The figure stirred, turning its head toward me, and that's when I realized something was wrong. Her face, it wasn't right. The features were too sharp, the eyes too dark, like twin voids. She smiled, and her teeth were jagged, too many for a human mouth. Ellie? I whispered again, my voice barely audible. The thing laughed. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The figure rose to its feet, impossibly tall, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. You came back, it said, but the voice wasn't Ellie's anymore. It was deeper, guttural, echoing in the small space. I turned and ran, tripping over the uneven floor. The thing followed, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. The stairs felt like they stretched forever, but I made it to the top and slammed the basement door shut, jamming the crowbar under the handle. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the pounding. The door rattled on its hinges, and I backed away, heart pounding. My flashlight flickered again, and I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows in the room were moving. I don't remember how I got out of the house. One minute I was in the living room, and the next I was outside, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, silent and still as if nothing had happened. I've tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But every time I close my eyes, I see that thing in the basement, and I hear Ellie's voice, soft, pleading, calling for help. And the worst part? Last night, I got another text.
Come back. Come back.
They told me the house was gone, demolished years ago after the fire. So when I saw it standing there, as intact as it had been the day I left, I thought I was losing my mind. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, drew me back inside. Now, I wish I'd stayed away. My name's Dan. I'm just an average guy, 31 years old, work in it, live alone in a tiny apartment in the city. My life isn't anything extraordinary, but I've made my peace with that. At least I thought I had until the call from my mom last week. She was moving to Florida to retire and needed me to go through some of my old stuff in her attic. I hadn't been back to my hometown in over a decade, not since I'd graduated high school and left that small, suffocating place behind. I thought it'd be a quick trip. A few hours to sort through some dusty boxes, maybe grab a coffee at the diner where I used to work, and then head back to the city. But as I drove through those familiar streets, memories I'd long buried began to surface. And then I saw it, the house. It sat at the end of Holloway Road, exactly where it had always been. The Chapman House, as everyone used to call it. When I was a kid, it was the neighborhood's version of a ghost story, a decrepit, abandoned home that no one dared to go near. Back then, the rumors were endless. Some said the house was cursed, but everyone who lived there either went mad or disappeared. Others claimed you could hear voices if you stood close enough to the front door. My friends and I were idiots, of course. We made bets, dared each other to go inside, but none of us ever lasted more than a few minutes. The place was just wrong. Then, when I was 13, there was a fire. I remember standing outside with the rest of the neighborhood, watching as flames devoured the house. By the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. They said the structure was so unstable, they'd have to tear it down. So why was it here? I pulled over, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe I'd made a mistake, taken a wrong turn. But no, this was Holloway Road. This was the spot where the house had burned to the ground. And yet, here it was. I sat in my car for what felt like forever, staring at the house. It looked just as it had before the fire, 2 stories tall, with peeling white paint and boarded-up windows. The front door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Every rational part of me screamed to drive away, but I couldn't. Something about the house felt like it was pulling me in, like a magnet I couldn't resist. Before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the overgrown lawn. The air was still, heavy, and the faint smell of burnt wood lingered, even after all these years. Just a quick look, I muttered to myself. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath my weight. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, but curiosity won out. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The interior was almost exactly as I remembered it, dusty, dark, and eerily quiet. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer afternoon. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The living room was empty except for a few broken chairs and a coffee table covered in graffiti. In the kitchen, the sink was rusted, and the cabinets hung open like gaping mouths. And then there were the stairs. They led up to the second floor, where none of us had ever dared to go as kids. Even now, standing at the base of those creaking steps, I felt that same knot of fear in my stomach. But I wasn't a kid anymore. I wasn't going to let an old house scare me. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning beneath me. The hallway at the top was narrow, with doors lining both sides. Most were closed, but one at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I approached the door. My hand shook as I pushed it open. The room was empty. It looked like it had once been a bedroom, though the bed frame was broken and the wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. The window at the far end was cracked, letting in a thin beam of sunlight. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at myself. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a small, charred box tucked into the corner of the room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched down to examine it. The box was covered in soot, but the hinges still worked. Inside, I found a stack of photographs, each one blackened at the edges. The first few were of the house itself, taken from different angles. But as I flipped through them, my stomach turned. The later photos were of me, as a child, standing on the front porch with my friends, sitting in my classroom at school, walking home with my backpack slung over one shoulder. My hands started to shake, and I dropped the box, the photographs scattering across the floor. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from downstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone was knocking on the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response? I crept back down the hallway, my footsteps barely making a sound. The tapping continued, echoing through the house. It was coming from the living room. I peered over the railing, but the room was empty. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt suffocating. And then I saw it, a shadow moving across the wall. It wasn't mine. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadow stopped. For a moment, everything was still, and then, slowly, it began to move toward the stairs. I bolted. I don't remember how I made it out of the house, but I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was gone. I haven't told anyone what happened. I don't think they'd believe me if I did, but sometimes, late at night, I hear that tapping sound again. And when I close my eyes, I see the photographs scattered across the floor. I know I should throw them away, but I can't bring myself to do it. Because the last one shows me standing in my apartment, and I'm not alone. I don't know why I decided to go back there. It wasn't like I had fond memories of the place. Quite the opposite, actually. But something about it felt unfinished, like a chapter I'd left open for far too long. Maybe I should start from the beginning. My name is Matt, and I'm just an ordinary guy. Late 20s, an office job that I hate but tolerate because it pays the bills and no real direction in life. I've always been the kind of person who avoids conflict, keeps his head down, and stays in his lane. But this was different. The house I'm talking about wasn't just any house. It was the place where my friends and I used to hang out when we were kids. Back then, it was just an old, run-down property on the edge of town. No one lived there, and it had the classic haunted house vibe. Peeling paint, broken windows, creaking floors. The kind of place you'd dare your friends to spend the night in. I never made it through the night. None of us did. We told ourselves it was just our imaginations. That the weird sounds we heard were the wind, the creaking stairs were because of the house settling, and the faint whispers were just echoes of our own voices. But even as a kid, I knew that wasn't true. We stopped going there after Sarah disappeared. Sarah was my best friend. She was brave, smarter than all of us, and the only one who dared to go upstairs that night. We waited for her, calling out her name, but she never came back down. The police searched the house and the woods behind it for weeks, but they never found anything. After that, the house was boarded up, and we never spoke of it again. At least, not until last week. It started with a dream. In it, I was standing in the doorway of the house, staring at the cracked, warped wood of the front door. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't move. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, I heard Sarah's voice. "Matt, help me." I woke up drenched in sweat. my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, that it didn't mean anything, but the voice, it was so real. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I did what any rational person would do. I ignored it. For a few days, I threw myself into work, went out with friends, and did everything I could to push the dream out of my mind. But every night it came back, and every night Sarah's voice got louder. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I called in sick to work, got in my car, and drove to the house. It was still there, standing like a forgotten relic at the edge of the woods. The boards on the windows had rotted away, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. I told myself I was just going to look, just to see it, to prove to myself that there was nothing there. The inside was worse than I remembered. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and the floor creaked under my weight. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it old, some of it fresh, but it wasn't the sight of the house that unnerved me. It was the silence. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that feels like it's pressing down on you. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to nerves. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice trembling. It was stupid, I know, but part of me needed to do it, to prove to myself that she wasn't here. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard a faint creak. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. No answer. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It's just the house settling, I told myself, just like we always said as kids, but even then I didn't believe it. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning under my weight. At the top, a hallway stretched out before me, dark and empty. Most of the doors were closed, but one at the far end was slightly ajar. It was Sarah's voice that made me move. "Matt, please, I need you." I pushed the door open, half expecting to find Sarah standing there, alive and well, but the room was empty. It looked like it had been a child's bedroom once. The walls were painted a pale pink, though the color had long since faded, and a broken bed frame leaned against one wall. On the floor, half buried under debris, was an old doll with a cracked porcelain face. For a moment, I almost laughed. This was it. This was what I'd been so afraid of. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it again. "Matt." The voice was so close, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but the room was still empty. "Sarah?" I whispered, and then the door slammed shut. I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the knob. It wouldn't budge. The whispers started then, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, overlapping until I couldn't make out the words. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but the whispers drowned me out. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, darker than the rest. But as I watched, it began to take shape. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. It felt like hours, though it could have been seconds. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The door creaked open, and the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, not stopping until I was back in my car. That was 3 days ago. I haven't told anyone what happened, and I haven't gone back. But last night, I woke up to the sound of whispers outside my bedroom door, and this time, they weren't calling Sarah's name. The first thing I noticed was the smell damp wood, mold, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. I hadn't set foot in that house in 20 years, and I swore I never would again. But when you get a call saying your childhood best friend has gone missing, you do things you'd normally never consider. If I'd known what I'd find in there, I wouldn't have gone back. My name's Eric. I'm 34 now, working a steady but unremarkable job in insurance. Most days I come home to my dog, a beer, and Netflix. Nothing glamorous, but it's predictable, and I like predictable. I grew up in a small town about 2 hours from where I live now, a place with one main street, a diner that never closed, and a lot of empty fields. And then there was the house. It sat on the edge of town, hidden behind a thicket of trees. To us kids, it was the place for dares and ghost stories. No one lived there, and no one knew who owned it. We called it the Vine House because of the ivy that choked its walls. The last time I saw it was the summer I turned 14, the summer I decided I was too old for stupid dares. That summer, My best friend Dave went inside on a dare and came out pale and shaking, refusing to talk about what happened. We stopped going there after that. It was late last Friday when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Kate, an old friend from back home. We hadn't spoken in years, but her voice was frantic. "It's Dave," she said. "He's missing." At first, I thought it was some mix-up. People lose touch all the time, right? But then she said the words that made my stomach drop. The last place anyone saw him was the Vine House. My first instinct was to say no. No to going back, no to being involved, but guilt has a way of overriding fear. Dave was my best friend once, and even though we'd grown apart, I couldn't ignore the knot in my chest. "I'll drive up," I told her. The house looked worse than I remembered. The years hadn't been kind. The roof sagged in places, and the ivy had practically consumed the second story. The windows were filthy, the front steps cracked. I parked on the dirt road, the engine of my car cutting out in an awkward silence. Kate wasn't there yet, but her directions had been clear. Meet at the house, check inside, and call the cops if we found anything. I stood there for a moment just staring. It felt like the house was staring back, daring me to come closer. When I finally stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned under my weight. The door was slightly ajar, just like it had been all those years ago. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Dust motes floated in the light streaming through the cracked windows. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing patches of discolored wood beneath. "Dave?" I called, my voice echoing in the emptiness. No answer. The living room was empty except for a broken chair and a pile of old newspapers. I moved cautiously, the floor creaking with every step. The kitchen was worse. Dishes were still in the sink, crusted with ancient grime, as if whoever had lived here had left in a hurry. As I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every shadow seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. I told myself it was just the house, old, creaky, and falling apart, but then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, coming from upstairs. I hesitated at the base of the stairs, staring up into the dim hallway above. The sound came again, soft and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. "Dave?" I called again, my voice cracking. The scratching stopped. Taking a deep breath, I climbed the stairs. Each step creaked louder than the last, and by the time I reached the top, my pulse was pounding in my ears. The hallway was lined with doors, most of them shut, but one at the far end was open just a crack. I approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. When I reached the door, I nudged it open with the toe of my shoe. The room was empty, just an old bedroom with a mattress on the floor and a broken mirror leaning against the wall. Relief washed over me for a moment. It's just an empty house, nothing more. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint, outlined in dust on the wooden floor, leading from the window to the closet. They didn't look fresh, but the sight of them still made my skin crawl. "Probably Dave's," I muttered to myself, trying to sound confident. I opened the closet, half expecting him to be hiding inside, but it was empty, just a few old hangers swaying slightly as if disturbed by a breeze. I laughed nervously. Maybe Kate was wrong. Maybe Dave wasn't here after all. I stepped back into the hallway, ready to leave when I heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it was coming from the living room. My heart raced as I descended the stairs. The living room was dark now, the light outside fading. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the scratching sound was louder, more insistent. It was coming from the corner of the room, where an old wooden cabinet stood. I approached it slowly, my breath shallow. The scratching stopped as I reached for the cabinet doors. When I opened them, I expected to find mice or maybe a raccoon, but there was nothing, just an empty cabinet, the wood splintered and rotting. And then I heard a whisper, "Eric, Eric." My blood ran cold. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. I spun around, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The shadows on the wall seemed to shift, pooling together like ink. And then I saw a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was Dave, or at least it looked like him. "Dave?" I whispered. He didn't move. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Eric," he said again, his voice hollow. I took a step toward him, and that's when I saw it, the thing behind him. It was a shape, tall and distorted, its features impossible to make out. It loomed over Dave, its long, shadowy arms draped over his shoulders. "Run!" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the house. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with every step. By the time I reached the front door, my chest was heaving and my legs felt like lead. I burst outside, the evening air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back. That was 3 days ago. I haven't told anyone what happened, not even Kate. She called the next day to tell me that Dave's body had been found in the woods near the house. They said it looked like he'd been running from something, but I know the truth. The house is still waiting, and I don't think it's done with me.